Tim Keller has a book called Centered Church. In that book, at the beginning of the book, well, is that true? Maybe later in the book, he has a section where he talks about what he calls the dynamics between an institution and a movement. And what he says in the chapter, I'm persuaded that he's right about this, is that in the history of the church, when God raises up some kind of new movement, you can imagine it this way. This is my gloss on how he describes it. There's a kind of a dial, and the needle on that movement at the beginning is 100% on the mission. And the movement, he gives all these great indicators of this is what a movement looks like in the beginning, and very often it is led by very charismatic and catalytic leaders, apostolic leaders. We've heard that term several times today and yesterday. It has very little structure. It has very few rules. And God often uses that to grow his people and to expand his kingdom. And over time, what he says is the movement has to, in order for it to persist, in order for it to continue to be effective, that needle has to come back a little bit from 100% mission, and it has to take on some characteristics of an institution, like rules, structure. And this is God's economy. This is what he says. And most of the great movements in the history of the church have that recipe, and they have that trajectory. Here's the danger, however, which he also identifies in the chapter. Here's the danger. The danger is that as more people come into the movement who have the giftings in management and administration and regulation, that needle stops being pointed at the mission. And the needle goes more and more and more and more, and at some point it passes a midline and it starts being about the organization itself. It starts being about the institution. It starts, so you have meetings about having meetings. You pass regulations about how you pass regulations. So what we want to do as an Anglican mission society, what we ought to want to do in our own faith, in our own churches, wherever we come from, we want to calibrate that well. If the needle is 100% on mission, people burn out. You can think about it in this way. The tip of the spear is the mission, right? The effectiveness of the tip of the spear is in proportion to the length and weight of the shaft of the spear. It's not the pretty part, though, right? It's not the business end of the spear, but the business end of the spear can't do its job without the rest of the stuff there. But the shaft of the spear is always in service of the tip. If you just cut off the tip, you just have, a broken broom handle maybe, right? And so that's what we want to talk about today. Where does the mission, the Anglican mission in America, fit into that structure that I just outlined? And more broadly, where does it fit in the Anglican world, which, like any other movement that God has raised up, also is affected by those dynamics that we just outlined, that needle sort of going back and forth. I like questions as we go along. So at the end, we're going all the way up to 3:45, and it's over. And I'll be up here to answer any questions you might have. But I typically think the best time to answer a question is right when you have it, because typically that was, we hope, generated by what was just said. And we can stop and maybe address it right then or postpone it till later. So I hope it will be somewhat interactive, and if you have a question, I hope that you won't feel shy at all to raise your hand, and we'll try to address it then. Deal? Deal? What does it mean to be an Anglican? Why does that matter? And how does AMIA fit into that? What does it mean to be an Anglican? Why does that even matter? And How does AMIA fit into the answer to those two questions? First, what does it mean to be an Anglican? In our context, Dustin and I, we worked together at St. Andrews in Little Rock, and we were talking recently to some folks outside our church and about the fact that when someone asks you, well, what do? You say, well, I'm a minister. Oh, what do you think the next question is? Where? St. Andrew's Church. What do you think the next question is? What kind of church is that? And you say an Anglican church, and they say it's a what? And it's an opportunity because we get to define what that means. We get to say, come and see, right? Not everyone views it that way. And so to sort of cut to the chase, there are two main views prevalent today on the answer to the question, what is an Anglican? Two main views. One view, and I say this not prejudicially, is the historic view. The other view is the more contemporary view. Before I talk about those two views, however, I want to say this. An Anglican is a certain flavor of Christian. So whatever it is, whichever of those two views, which we'll outline in a second, whichever one of those two views is the one you think, yeah, that's the one. I hope you like the historic one, but we'll come to that. Whichever one that is, we ought to be able to say, well, whatever an Anglican is a particular type, particular expression of a Christian. So if a man is a bishop in a church that everyone recognizes to be an Anglican church, and the man says Jesus' body rotted in the grave, I would say, friend, I don't know if you're a Christian. You have all the bona fides to be an Anglican. But if being an Anglican just is downstream from the question, what is a Christian, it ought to include everything about being a Christian, which means not denying essentials of the faith. So, bear that in mind as we move through. Whatever an Anglican is, it's a particular flavor, a particular expression of a Christian. Fair? Fair. The first and the historic answer to the question, what is an Anglican? I'll just set it out up front. The two views are, I was talking to my wife about this, and her eyes glazed over, so it happens. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because I don't want your eyes to glaze over. I prize highly clarity. A lot of confusion and ultimately hurt feelings can come out of a lack of clarity. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this, but what I want to tell you is it's going to sound a little bit academic for a second, but I promise it's not a preview of things to come. We're going to take this, we're going to say, what does it mean to be an Anglican? Here are the two views. Now, why does that matter? Why does the question matter? Okay, so that's where we're headed in a second. So please bear with me for a second as we talk about these two views. The formulary view, what I'm calling the formulary view, and what I'll call the regulatory view. Everybody say formulary? Formulary. Regulatory. Regulatory. The formulary view is this. What does it mean to be an Anglican? There are three formularies: the 39 Articles, the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, and the Ordinal, which is a component part of the Book of Common Prayer. The Ordinal talks about having priests, deacons, and bishops, and talks about how they come into those positions. So the formularies, historically, are those three things. I've heard people say that there is no Anglican-specific doctrine. That's false. Because there are some specifics that deal with Anglicans. And those are those formularies that we just described, okay? 39 Articles, Book of Common Prayer, and the Ordinal. All right, so that's the one view. A certain set of doctrine, beliefs, and practices that together compose our shared life. The alternative view is what I call the regulatory view. The regulatory view. And there's a term that some people use to refer to these regulations or regulatory entities, and they call it the instruments of unity. And you'll see in a second, even that term is in flux. The instruments of unity, and there are sort of four things. One, the Archbishop, and this is in historical, the order of historical appearance, okay? The Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lambeth Conference, which is where the Archbishop of Canterbury invites the recognized Anglican bishops, and they're sort of circular there. What does it mean to be a recognized Anglican bishop? Well, it means that the Archbishop invites you. Well, who does he invite? Well, he invites recognized Anglican bishops to this decennial conference every 10 years. Then there's the third thing, the Anglican Consultative Council, which is, of these four, the only one that's composed of also lay people. The others have bishops and archbishops, no lay people. And the Anglican Consultative Council is a regulatory group that meets about every 2 years that tries to help define what it means to be an Anglican. And the last one is the primates meeting, primates and archbishop. And they meet together. Instruments of unity. Formulary, regulatory. And I said that the latter, the term, instruments of unity, is a newer term. Instruments of unity is a newer term. It's a contemporary term. And part of it is because, part of the difference in opinions here is because over time, what happened as you get into the later 1800s, 1900s, we have a major crisis in most Christian denominations around the question, what does it even mean to be a Christian? No polity can save. Polity is a particular way that your church is governed. No polity can save a church or a people in that church from error and heresy. There's not a bulletproof one. And so what happened is that these various denominations started to experience a lot of internal conflict, which ultimately led to different kinds of splits and things like that. And all that stuff kind of starts heating up in the late 1800s, in large part because of German biblical scholarship. And so there's the question, what does it even mean to be a Christian? Well, since I said earlier that whatever it means to be an Anglican is downstream of the question, what does it mean to be a Christian? If we can't have agreement on the question, what does it mean to be a Christian? Well, there's probably also going to be disagreement downstream about what does it mean to be an Anglican. And what happens when there's disagreement about that kind of a question, or at least what's happened historically, is into the breach has come regulations. So principally, in some places today, what it means to be an Anglican is that you have a kind of membership card from the Anglican Consultative Council that says you're legit. You can have people, who I said earlier, who have been ordained properly, have been consecrated as a bishop properly, and they deny the bodily resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. But they meet the criteria, you know, the regulatory criteria. But we would say they've denied some of the essentials of the faith, which is more important. Which is more important. So what does it mean to be an Anglican? It depends on who you ask. Right? And it depends on which of those views or some mashup of those two views. Here's why that matters. We're going to move off of that part. I told you that was going to be brief. I hope that was it's not very painful. Let me give you an initial assessment, my sense of that question. What does it mean to be an Anglican? Formularies first, regulatory structures second, all in the spirit of the Great Commandment and in service of the Great Commission. Formularies first, regulatory structures second, all in the spirit of the Great Commandment and the service of the Great Commission. If you have a membership card, but you deny essentials of the faith, what are you holding? What's the point? That's where that needle has gone. It starts to move that we talked about at the beginning. And it's now gone way past center. And it's now going back and it's pointing at something else. And somebody is very confused. So formularies first. That was the idea there. Regulatory structure second. It's important. The regulatory structure is important, but it can't be allowed to supplant and be preeminent over the formularies. And I'll say why in just a second. So formularies first, regulatory structure second, which is important. All in the spirit of the Great Commandment. Are you loving your neighbor as yourself? And are you loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength? 1 second, Nate. And are you doing it in service of the Great Commission? We're going to go next to why this matters. Nate?
Maybe that's my question. You said regulatory is important. Why is it important?
The question is, why is the regulatory structure important? Because it helps to define our shared life together. But it's just like why polity in a particular church is important. It helps to define your shared life together. But it can't bear the freight of substituting for Christian beliefs and practices. I heard Jack Packer say one time, the Lord's calling on me is to teach people the truths that Christians live by and then teach them how to live by those truths. If a person tries to substitute those two things for a regulatory structure, they've basically jettisoned the whole point of what the regulatory structure ought to be about. Does that help your question there? All right. So why does this question matter? Why is it important? These formularies are old. We saw 1662, Book of Common Prayer, 39 Articles, 1571. And some of the language in those documents are odd to us. Some of the language in the 39 Articles is clearly directed only at some events that were taking place in the 16th century. They're not perfect documents. They're just not. And they are historically situated documents. The reason, so in the Anglican mission, we just did this, today's Friday, Tuesday, I think, or maybe it was Wednesday. Part of what we do in the Anglican mission as priests and bishops and deacons, what we say is we hold to these things, the 39 Articles, 1662 Book of Common Prayer, and the Ordinal, because we believe that the same are conformable to the Scriptures. They're not perfect documents, but they have a borrowed authority because we believe them to be faithful expressions of the Scriptures. Why does this stuff matter? Because we believe them to be faithful expressions of the Scriptures. Not final. This is the key thing. Not final, but faithful expressions of what Christ taught. And to that point, it's extraordinarily difficult for me to speak in public at a gathering of brothers and sisters and not read the Scripture. To this point, about we believe them not because they're perfect documents, because we think that they're faithful expressions of what Christ taught. Listen to what the Apostle John tells us in John chapter 7. And I'll have to skip a few verses now because it's sort of a lengthy passage. There's one theme I want to draw out. So I'll start in verse 25 and sort of set the scene here. Jesus is out teaching in public. And he does this. He says things and people don't like. And there's there's big groups all the time. They follow him around everywhere. And sometimes he'll stop and turn around and he'll say, I'm not sure all of you guys are supposed to be here. If you are not willing to take up your cross, to take up this public instrument of shame and execution, you should probably leave. So he's a weird speaker because he draws all these people and then he tells them to leave a lot. And there's the passage just a chapter before this in John 6 where Jesus says some crazy stuff about eating my flesh and drinking my blood, and it's so offensive to everybody that they leave. And Jesus turns to the disciples, the stalwart band of brothers, and he says, Are you going to leave too? And they don't say, absolutely not. You're the man. They say, where else will we go? So here's one of these instances where Jesus is out teaching. John chapter 7. And people hear him teaching regularly. They're passing by, and they know that the authorities are not happy about this. And so they draw an inference that you and I would probably draw. You say, where are the cops? Where are the authorities? They must have changed their mind on this guy. Otherwise, they would come and arrest him. And so that's what the people say. Verse 25, some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, is not this the man, Jesus, whom they seek to kill, the authorities? And yet here he is, speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities really know that he is the Messiah? Rib. Is the reason why they're not arresting this guy is because they've had a change of heart and they actually think he's the Messiah? Well, the Pharisees, they don't like that. And so dropping down to verse 32, the text continues, the Pharisees heard the crowd muttering these things about him, and the chief priests and Pharisees sent officers to arrest him. Oh, you guys think we are endorsing him by our not arresting him? Let's get after that and we're going to arrest him. And so the text says they sent officers. And these are not mall cops that they send. These guys are hardened soldiers. Dropping down a few verses, they go and find Jesus, still teaching out there. Starting in verse 40, when they heard these words, the crowd, some of the people said, this really is a prophet. Remember, these guys are standing here, the soldiers. Others said, this is the Messiah, but some said, is the Messiah supposed to come from Galilee? Doesn't the scripture say that Christ comes from the offspring of David and supposed to come from Bethlehem, the village where David was? There's a question among the crowd, who is this guy? So there was a division among the people over them. And some of them wanted to arrest Jesus, but no one laid hands on him. And then the officers, the soldiers, then came back to the chief priests. They left. They came back to the chief priests and Pharisees and the Pharisees said to them, why did you not bring him? Why did you not arrest him and bring him to us? And their answer is astonishing. What they say is not, well, there was a crowd, see, and it was hard to get in there, and what had happened was then they had these weapons. They don't say that. What they say next is, the officers answered, saying, no one ever spoke like this man. And the King James is a really beautiful way of phrasing it. No man ever spoke like this man. It was not by force that these guys were repelled. It was by the power of the word of the Messiah. No one ever spoke like this man. Why does this question matter? Why does this whole issue about regulatory formulary, why does that matter? Because what we want to be about is the words of the Messiah. That's what we want to be about. And things that faithfully communicate the words of the Messiah today, we want to be about those. Things that try to take their place, we have to be very leery of that. We have to watch out for that. So how does AMIA fit into this question here about what does it mean to be an Anglican? Well, you've heard several times, several people say AMIA is a three streams mission society. Apostolic works and mission, focusing on church planting, raising up and resourcing, recruiting leaders, and other apostolic works. So it's this society. But what is that? What is a society? What you need to know is that word is not made up. The Anglican mission didn't make up that term. Nor did it make up the concept that the term represents. And let me give you a 30-second history on some of this. The notion that the concept that there's going to be a group of people who feel called together to engage in a particular shared calling or practice. People call it a charism, a gifting. That notion goes back a long way. It arguably goes back past the 13th century, but I'll start in the 13th century with the establishment of the Franciscan order in 1209. A few years later, the establishment of the Dominican order in 1211. When those two, they were called mendicant orders because they were traveling. Because before them, the idea was, if you're going to be a real Christian, what you need to be is a religious. That's the term. You need to be a religious, a monk, nun, or a priest. And the best kind of those, and that time really the only kind, was the ones who were sequestered. To get holy, you have to go away. You have to go away from everyone. And of course, you need retreats. All that's important. Don't hear what I'm not saying. But that was the idea at the time. Enter these other guys who came in, Francis, Dominic, and others who said, now actually, what we need to do is we need to take that rule of life and we need to go out among the people. And we need to work with the people. And guess what? When those groups started, they were despised. So one of the great heroes for me in history is a man named Thomas Aquinas. You ever heard of Thomas Aquinas? Thomas Aquinas was born in 1224, shortly after the founding of the Dominican order. And he joined the Dominican order in 1244. And his parents were so upset that he would waste his life in this backward, junky society that they staged a kidnapping of him. His brother, one of his brothers, was a knight. They kidnapped him, and they actually imprisoned him. His family did. This is such a shame, you know. So we go way back. Franciscans, Dominicans. We go in the 16th century, 1534, the founding of the Jesuit order. Heard of the Jesuits? The Jesuit order. Each one of these groups, here's the important part in terms of the concept, each one of these groups felt that they had a certain calling on their lives together, and they were going to form a group together to carry out that shared calling and that shared work. And so I've heard, this is a story from a Jesuit, I've heard that there's a little, there's a joke. It says there was a service being held, a mass being held at a Catholic cathedral, and there was a Jesuit, and there was a Franciscan, and there was a Dominican, and the lights went out. And the Franciscans, whose calling, their charism, is about living in poverty and helping those who are also living in poverty. And the Franciscan extolled that it was so great that they get to live in greater poverty. And the Dominican, their calling, they're called the Order of Preachers, OP, if you see that after everybody's saying. Their main thing is theology and philosophy and preaching and teaching. And the Jesuit in the joke tells the story. And the Dominican got up and gave a very learned discourse about how Christ is the light of the world. And the Jesuit, in their calling, is all about practicality. Most of the Jesuits have a PhD in theology and then one in astrophysics or a PhD, and the Jesuit says he went down into the basement and fixed the fuse box. The point is that they gathered together for a shared life to carry out a particular calling. 1698, you have the founding of the first Anglican society, the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, SPCK. Later, you have the Church Mission Society in the late 1700s, and you have others. The notion of a society is very old. Even the term society is sort of old. So it's not invented, and it shares those two characteristics. People coming together to carry out a shared calling they believe God has brought them to, and to do that in the power of some kind of gifting that they believe that they have. And so the Anglican mission in America, we take our place, in a certain sense, in that line of societies, to reach the lost in North America with the gospel. To reach the lost in North America with the gospel. It's like Philip was saying, it's about mission, nothing more, nothing less. Reaching the lost, discipling the found, sending the mature. Through church planting, leadership, development, apostolic works. That's the shared calling There are other Anglicans in our neck of the woods, right? There are other Anglicans. So we have our friends in ACNA, and they have a different calling. They have a certain structure that they operate under, and we bless them in that, and we're thankful for them. And we have this other calling, this society calling, society focus. What does it mean to be an Anglican? Formularies first, regulatory structures second. In the spirit of the Great Commandment, in the service of the Great Commission. Why does that matter? That sequence like that? Because it is a way, not the only way, it is a way to bring Christ's words to needy people. Never man spoke like that man. Why the Anglican mission? To summarize, I think a very beautiful answer from John Stott when he was asked the question, why are you an Anglican? Why be in the mission? And his answer was, Stott's answer was, why be an Anglican? It's a good boat to fish from. Why be in the Anglican mission in America? We're designed to carry fishers. And that's you, and that's me. We're designed to equip fishers, and that's you, and that's me. That's the focus, that's the goal, being fishers of people. The Anglican mission's place in global Anglicanism, it's about reaching the lost with a particular flavor. 3 streams, Anglican flavor. Questions? Beth? So she said, what would ACNA say that their purpose is? How is it different in reaching lost? I don't know what the ACNA says their purpose is. I'm sure that they have a purpose statement. Maybe they do. I suspect they'd say, oh yeah, our purpose is reaching the lost. The difference is in the way you go about it. It's in the manner in which you undertake that. And going back to the example we gave at the beginning about the dial, remember that where I talked about the movement, and there's the mission on one side, and there's the organization and the institution on the other side. And when things typically start, the needle is all the way over to the movement on the mission side. And in order for it to continue, the needle has to come back a little bit, but it has to always be pointed toward that. People are going to disagree on where that needle ought to be. And that's partly reflects. Everybody agrees, yeah, you need some structure. You need some of that. It's healthy. What exactly should the structures be? People are going to disagree on that. And that's part of that. Jay?
I like that you talk about the other societies of the past. What, in the Roman Catholic world, what sort of regulatory entities either inhibited or enabled those earlier societies?
That's a good question. The question is, speaking about some of the Roman Catholic societies, the question is what sort of entities enabled or hindered their foundation and development? And that's a really good question. The short of it is, well, I should say this. I'm not an expert on all those societies, so I can't give a complete answer to that question. I can speak more about the Dominicans and the Jesuits than I can about the others. So, say for example, the Jesuits. The Jesuits are today one are called 3 of what are called pontifical orders, which means that the idea is they're founded by the Pope and they answer to the Pope, not to diocesan bishops. So the way that works is typically you have a geographical area, you have a bishop who's in charge of that area, and the bishop has to say so about what's happening in his area. Well, the Jesuits move in. What's going to happen? Who gets to say, you can't have your group here, meet here. No, you can't. And so there were issues with that, and there were times that the Jesuits fell in and out of favor with the papacy. So that's always been an issue with the Catholic orders, is how the the societies move in and out geographically with the bishops, the geographical bishops. It's easier, however, for the Catholics to work that system because they're all under one system. There's a head, and they all share one canon law. So that's a little bit of an answer. I probably shouldn't say much more because I don't want to speak on things I don't know a lot about.
Based on what you learned in kind of researching these things, and you look backwards, was it absolutely necessary for Bishop Chuck to get the covering of Rwanda when he left? Or do you see it as an optional piece, looking backwards? Could he have taken the documents that you referenced in the formularies and established what we have today?
No. Is the short answer to that. Ethan? I mean, you want me to expound on it? Maybe I can come back to that one if there's a follow-up. Ethan?
You talked about the regulatory principles, and you said that if we have regulatory principles and we lose the formularies, we're in trouble.
Agreed.
What happens when the regulatory principles aren't doing the work they're supposed to be doing, when they're breaking down? How are we still Anglican if those things are failing?
What work are the regulatory items are supposed?
You mentioned those four, principles of unity that they're to, help us understand what it means to be Anglican. But like, how are they functioning for us now in AMIA?
Yeah, it's a mess. That's the short answer to the question.
So does that imply that our primary sense of identity is then grounded in formularies?
No, well, I said every Anglican's primary identity ought to be grounded in that.
Okay, and then the regulatory principles are ancillary to our identity.
They should be in service of that identity. They can't take the place of it, and they shouldn't fall away. Because every organization, remember the movement, you have to have some rules. You have to have some shared understanding about who can come and be a part of the club. That's all important. The problem is if that supplants and takes the place of what it means to be a Christian, and then to have these specifics around Anglicanism. Does that make sense? And so that, I mean...
Does that imply that if the regulatory principles are not doing that work anymore, that something else needs to be happening?
Very good. So the question is, does that imply that if the regulatory principles, these instruments of unity, are not doing that work anymore, that something else needs to happen? I would say it this way: the instruments of unity were designed. Even that term is very, very new. The idea that you could put forth the regulations and set them into the breach, and that they would be able to hold things together, where people can't even agree on what it means to be a Christian. That's the idea that has been shown to fail. Now, it's more complicated than that. There's more to say on that. So yeah, does there need to be other things around, like, these regulatory? Absolutely. I'm a lawyer. I like rules. Rules cannot replace relationship, and for Christians, they cannot replace the gospel. The rules have to reflect the relationships. They have to set guardrails for the relationships. And how that gets worked out, no one's asked me, and I'm not wise enough to know how that should go. John? Last question, then we got to wrap up. And then if you want to come ask me a question, happy to help.
I actually wanted to make a comment.
Uh-oh.
Should I not? Shula, you want me to correct you when you're done? and Bishop Kevin will correct me when I'm done.
Go ahead.
You and I, you know my heart. I love you. We were close. The context of the Reformation in England, even in the era when the ordinal was written in 1550 and the articles in 1571, I'm not as sure about 1662, but certainly the first two, was we are part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. We are part of the creedally Orthodox Church of Jesus Christ. And that's just a really bigger bubble. I hate to use bubble, but it's a much bigger sphere. That was the water we swim in. That was the inheritance we had. So the formularies were trying to attack particular crisis issues at that time.
Right.
But the bigger context was we belong to
started singing the creed but not believing it, that's when we started to have problems.
Right.
Now, maybe there'd always been some of that problem, but the challenge of that is that's a much bigger thing.
Yeah.
And for those Anglicans, and I'm one, who actually believe that to be our inheritance, the last 100 years of Anglican history have been a problem. You know, because a greater truth, a more profound foundational truth, has been parted from.
Yeah.
And as each parting from that greater truth has happened, the Anglican family is divided and divided and divided and divided and divided and divided, so that it is true, if there are 10 men in the room and they go to 10 spots and they're all ordained, and you ask them what's an Anglican, you're going to get 10 answers.
Right.
So it's a complicated moment. Now I think that it's a moment of new reformation. And we're in it, and it's a mess, and I'd like to live in a calmer age, but no matter where we are, no one ever spoke like this man.
Yeah. So let me say.
Jesus and the scriptures in the crisis.
Yes.
I don't know what else to say.
Thank you, John. Let me say one thing, and then we'll close. This is the point about there's like a Chinese blessing. May you live in interesting times. And for those of us who believe in God's providence, for such a time as this, you have been called. You, sir, you have been called. You have been called. For such a time as this. And it's a messy time, but at the end of the day, we're not called to fix everything. We're called to be faithful, as Jared said, image bearers of the risen Lord Jesus Christ. And there's a particular way that Anglicans can do that in a way that is faithful to what Christ has said, in a way that's beautiful. And that's our challenge, to carry that out, to find those whom God has called or is calling to himself, and to pray that we as broken instruments who don't have the power to fix this stuff ourselves and are dismayed and often hurt by the goings-on, that we are used by the Lord in his service. I'll take questions at the end. I'll take questions now if you want to come up. That's it.